Welcome to today's web conference on SEC, FINRA, and NFA's zeroing in on cybersecurity and how you can prepare, presented by Foley & Lardner, LLP. Hello everyone, my name is David Pulio and I'm with Foley & Lardner's marketing department. On behalf of Foley, I would like to thank you for joining us for today's conference. Now I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker is Aaron Tantleff. Aaron Tantleff is a partner and intellectual property lawyer with Foley & Lardner. He is a member of the firm's technology, transactions, and outsourcing practice, as well as our privacy, security, and information management practice. His practice focuses on providing legal and strategic guidance regarding information technology, privacy, security, and information management matters, as well as dealing with state, federal, and international restrictions on the use of information. Before we begin, we do have a few housekeeping announcements. Questions can be entered via the Q&A widget open on the left-hand side of your screen. We will address questions at the end of the program, time permitting. Today's program will last approximately 1 hour, followed by a short question and answer session. The webcast console you are looking at can be completely customized. You can resize or move any of the windows that you have open, including maximizing the PowerPoint presentation on your screen. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the help button below the presentation window. It is designated with a question mark icon. The PowerPoint presentation will also be available on our website at foley.com in the next few days. You may also acquire a copy of the slides via the resource list widget, which is also open on the left-hand side of your screen. Today's program will be recorded and will also be available on Foley's website in the next few days. Foley will apply for CLE credit after this web conference. If you did not supply your CLE information upon registration, please send an email to Brooke Radford at bradford@foley.com. Her information is also available in the calendar appointments, invitations, and confirmation emails that you received prior to this conference. To be eligible for CLE, you will need to log into this On24 session on a computer and answer a polling question during the program. And as a final note, those seeking Kansas, New York, or New Jersey CLE credit are required to complete an attorney affirmation form in addition to the polling question that will appear during the program. A 5-digit code will be announced. Please email your form to Brooke Radford, again, at bradford@foley.com immediately following the program. And at this time, I will turn it over to our speaker, Aaron Tantleff, and I wish you all a wonderful conference.
Thank you. So this is Aaron Tantleff. So I'll start off with sort of just why are we here, or what happened that caused that all this uproar in the industry. I mean, so essentially, things such as this, a quote saying that 9 out of 10 financial service organizations, or 93%, have experienced an incident in which the adequacy of their online security was tested, resulting in some type of attack. Now, of course, one of the things that we talk to clients about is that this is all based upon those that have actually experienced one. This isn't even those that have not, that currently have attacks that are unknown to them. And so the idea is probably roughly 100% of companies have had some type of incident that, if they all fit into one of two categories. Those, if you've heard this before, those have already had some type of incident, and those who have had one but don't yet know about it. But a couple of other things in terms of background as to how do we get here, as to why this is important. That essentially, a lot of times when people start talking about this, people think always about security, and they immediately talk about privacy as well. And privacy is only one aspect of security. And certainly when you talk about privacy, people also talk about personally identifiable information. While that's critical, and to all the people on the phone in terms of your own operations, customer information as well is also critical. But there's lots of other information. There's lots of other issues that within the company, in addition to things like the company information, employee information, transaction data, account information, causing problems, inability to denial of service attacks, the inability to conduct transactions, fraudulent transactions. And we've seen these types of things cost companies, in fact, far more than even a breach of personally identifiable or financial information would cause a company. And so these are really significant matters. So to give you an idea, when you talk about all these other things, not just the PII matters, but all the other things, it's estimated, depending on which study you look at and depending on whether it's a public or private entity that's doing the study, somewhere between $200 to $250 billion a year in the U.S. and nearly 538 or so billion globally in terms of loss or in terms of loss of IP and other things outside of the PII world. But also understand that all these other factors, companies tend to underestimate the risk of loss because no one really wants to talk about things that are not public. But it's estimated to cost, on a global economy basis, incidents related to cybersecurity, about $400 billion, or about 20% of the revenue is lost to the global economy due to internet. So a couple other things, some of the most egregious security incidents of all of 2014 affecting all industries, and number 3 on the hot list is the financial service industry. But miscellaneous errors accounts for about almost 30%. Insider misuse counts for about 20%, trying to understand your own employees. Physical loss, theft, another 15% or so, and there's a whole bunch of other things as well. That's important to understand. But and some of in addition again to just loss of identifiable information, there's as you can imagine, there's also huge components to loss. Loss of customers, loss of business, increased costs to retain future customers, reputational loss, goodwill loss, inability, difficulty in contracting with third parties. And then sort of finally on this sort of note as to the background of all this is that one thing that makes all of this really difficult for companies to deal with is that when you have a lot of these cyber intrusions and security incidents, they frequently leave no traces of evidence. A lot of them are actually fairly sophisticated, or by the time that you find them, the insider is well gone. It's really easy for an attacker to hide this. We're not talking about a physical intrusion, somebody walking in and holding up a place. Going through the electronic world, the ether makes it fairly easy. And because there is no physicality to it, there's no harm to a human. It's not observed in the same manner. And it turns out it's fairly inexpensive to launch an attack against a company. So you don't have to be well funded. You don't even have to be that smart to do these things. A lot of these techniques are fairly easy. You can go on the internet and you can buy, or you can even view for free a number of these, number of hacks that are available. There are lots of hacking clubs. There's organizations to do all this, and obviously it goes all the way up from state-sponsored crime to organized crime down to a bunch of pimply-faced kids in a garage or in a basement somewhere. And also just the interconnectivity of the internet makes it fairly difficult to really to block access to your network, unlike putting up a wall around a company and a physical organization. And then finally, just as you can imagine, the international laws and domestically as well make it fairly difficult to sort of get a handle on everything. So the first question is, everyone on the phone is saying, does this apply to me? And the answer is, well, as you'll hear in this presentation, there's some requirements coming down from the NFA, from SEC and FINRA, and so those examples are here on the slides in terms of, if anyone registered with the CFTC will fall under the NFA requirements. Any registered broker-dealers and investment advisors under SEC and FINRA. And then I say, anyone else, and the question is, there's the comment from the commissioner stating that just about everyone in the financial service market or in the financial marketplace really should be subjected to these rules. And I think over time we're going to see some additional proposals and additional requirements and people becoming subject to, and organizations becoming subject to these rules. So a little bit of the background of all of this. Back in 2013, February 2013, President Obama had issued an executive order, which was designed to sort of really improve the critical infrastructure in cybersecurity. And at that point, it was to develop a sort of voluntary risk-based cybersecurity framework. It was really about, at that point, sort of having the industry help to develop a set of guidelines. And it was based upon sort of the NIST cybersecurity framework. And I apologize for the really small font on the right, but the big issues are really on the 5 steps sort of on the left, which is to identify, all those areas of, what you need to cover. How are you going to cover it? By which means, how are you going to protect it? And things like access controls and information security. Detect how are you going to detect and understand and analyze when an intrusion happens? How are you going to monitor? How are you going to become aware of that? And the next, and then respond. What is your incident response plan going to be? How are you going to analyze a response? What are you going to do? And sort of like lessons learned. How are you going to use this information to, in the future to prevent this from happening again? And then sort of recover. How do you get back to, how do you return the system to sort of your normal status? So we originally had then, as I said, there was this initial roundtable, which I'll get to in a moment, which I think is I have these slides reversed. I apologize for that. But originally there was, so let's get to that first, and we'll come back for a moment. So we had the roundtables, which were part of the, there was the first sort of cybersecurity initiative, and that was talking with a number of a roundtable and asking a bunch of questions, and in which case they came up with sort of the biggest threats, biggest concerns that they had at the point were IT failures and insider threats. And IT failures are those things which create internal vulnerabilities or these internal threats which allow an external vulnerability to occur. So things like malware, advanced persistent threats, so things that an organization can do internally to prevent this access from a third party, and then sort of insider threats. And I don't mean that someone's holding the company hostage, but it's where you have the employees who will click on malware or who will, via social engineering, will give up the keys to the kingdom because it's too easy for someone to go online onto Facebook and other places and gather a whole bunch of information, design an attack to make someone think that they have, they're in a safe environment, and then they make available, they give access to a company. So an example of that was the other day. We had a client who got a call from one of their vendors, and it turns out the vendor saying, "Why haven't we received payment?" And they said, "Well, we do. We've been paying you quite a bit, in fact." And here's all the records. And it turns out that someone was able to launch an attack via social engineering, get someone to, get them internal, get them access into the system. They routed through into the accounts payable, made some changes to the account numbers, and it turns out now the last $5 million or so that was being paid ended up, instead of going to the vendor, ended up going to a third party offshore, money never seen again. As you can imagine, not so wonderful. But that is something that happened. It is fairly common. This week I'm dealing with, in fact, just before this presentation, I'm dealing with another one where we're talking about spoofing, using, getting inside, and then sending out emails to make customers or to make, third parties believe that you're contacting them with orders and requests and for product and services. So from all this, again, from the roundtable, so he said, some of the biggest things that came out of this is they need to, a better job needs to be done at identifying what types of information needs to be protected. And in some cases, you may need multiple layers. So based upon whether we're talking identifiable information, intellectual property or otherwise, different forms that are appropriate, certain information or certain procedures that are appropriate for those types of data. And again, in many cases, multiple layers, so firewalls and access controls, et cetera, all are needed in order to protect the data within a network. And I have a couple of examples there on the second bullet point. So on access control, there's multiple ways to do so. So the two biggest ones, really, authentication. How do you identify who the individual is that's trying to access, or the program that's trying to access information? And then access control, saying, okay, now that we know who is accessing who or what, should they be allowed to access it? Do we have procedures in place to say that person A is allowed to access, person B is not? And then flagging things like this to say, well, if person A or person B is not supposed to be accessing, why do they keep trying to ping it? And take it a step further is identifying these things in connection with the last point, which is centralized monitoring and monitoring that activity. So another recent example was someone else, there was an access control problem because there was someone who was identified who had the privilege or had access rights or privileges to both work remote and on-site. The system would log it all and would identify that this is the right credentials, et cetera, and grant them access. But it turns out that the person every day from the same hours, this was a long-term play, but was looking at monitoring someone's behavior and then started logging in and out around the same times that the individual was actually doing so. So every day there was an individual logging in on site, as well as from a remote location at least 500 miles away. The system did identify the dual login, did flag it, but there was no real monitoring of this to see, or flagging or sending this off to somebody to say who's looking at this, how is this being identified that we have a problem here, that we have one individual logging in at the same time from two different locations that are physically impossible to be at. And so it's understanding your systems and understanding what you need to do and how you control it in order to help mitigate some of this risk. So I'm going to jump back just a slide, 2 slides. I apologize. In terms of, again, so from that we had the roundtable, and then we have we end up with this sort of idea of trying to assess the cybersecurity preparedness, and they want in order to gather those information practices, and that's sort of the first and the main bullet points sort of summarizing the roundtables. And they issued a risk alert, which was based upon the summary of the roundtable. And at that point, the SEC chair, Mary Jo White, had expressed the importance of cybersecurity and saying just how important it was within the marketplace. And the quote was that cybersecurity has become one of the most significant issues affecting investors, corporate issuers, and financial institutions, really just about everybody in the financial marketplace. And you saw that statement I copied over into one of the earlier slide about how prevalent this is going to be. So just those individuals and entities that are not subject today may find themselves soon. And the commissioner had essentially stated that it's not an overstatement to say that cybersecurity is one of the defining issues of our time. And I can pull off yet a whole other set of quotes in terms of just how this is the U.S. CFTC commissioner said that cybersecurity risk is the greatest concern that they have today. So we can keep, this can go on in terms of just how important this is going to be. So moving on to the February 2015 SEC, risk alert, which really examined the results of the initial cybersecurity examination, and it summarized findings from more than 100 different registered investment advisors and broker-dealers. And most of those entities they had examined, turns out, had been directly or indirectly attacked as a result of a cybersecurity attack. And of course, this just plays right into the why are we doing this? So the whole idea of this risk, or the whole idea of this risk alert is really to sort of provide some guidance. And the SEC saying that we're really going to investigate. And there's approximately, if I'm not mistaken, about 4,500 broker-dealers and more than 10,000 investment advisors in the U.S. And part of what they're doing is sort of, provide this risk alert is to provide guidance as to what the SEC is looking for. There is no formal yet statement as to what the requirements are going to be. There's a lot of, right now, looking at, those policies and procedures that are sort of reasonably designed to protect against threats to the security or integrity of customer information and to prevent against unauthorized access to the customer information. And so the whole idea is really just they're still trying to understand what is reasonable. And there is an appendix to this, and we'll talk about that in a moment, that really outlines a lot of those questions as to really what's going to be the area of this focus. But including, we talk about the risk alert is, again, that's this sample cybersecurity document. And it's really to allow organizations to look at this and say, what are the tools that they're going to be held accountable for? How do they analyze their own environment, their own policies and procedures? What is the SEC going to be asking us? And a lot of those, to be perfectly honest, are the exact same requirements that at least in terms of what I've been digging through, are the ones that I advise everybody else on in terms of cybersecurity. And it's no coincidence. I mean, they're all based upon the same sort of NIST cybersecurity framework, and there's some other best practices as well. But one of the other things that's very important, which we've always seen, and I preach it all the time, but we see a very low compliance on, addressing outside vendors. And I put this as a knock to myself as well. But it's all third parties, and everyone's heard about Target and all these other incidents, and almost every major incident that does happen in an environment, whether I talk about it being a individual, whether I talk about being an insider threat or otherwise, is all predicated actually from vendors. It is a significant majority of these attacks do originate through the vendor environment. And the fact that there is such low compliance with doing diligence on vendors, it's alarming. And that is actually one of the major risks, that if you actually look through when we go through talking about what are these 6 areas, vendor diligence really falls under a couple of areas. But and not to knock myself, but when we talk about third-party vendors, you need to look at everyone, including us as lawyers and but also accounting and marketing and everyone else who's really going to have access to information. So no stone should be left unturned, I should say. So it turns out, from the risk alert, we learned that apparently almost 80% of investment advisors conduct periodic firm-wide assessments. Great, sure, but only a third of those actually either require or perform assessments on the vendors. And this is not just the lawyers, but this is all those third-party vendors. And everyone on the phone knows you probably have lots of third-party vendors in your environment. So as I said, the risk, looking at the vendors is something that has a very low compliance rate. And that's just, again, given the level of risk from vendors, something that really needs to change. And fewer than a quarter of all investment advisors incorporate cybersecurity requirements into contracts with vendors. So, it's something that I harp on every time I deal with it. But when I look at contracts that I have, that I didn't originate, or I look at form contracts, it really is true that there is a very low compliance rate with respect to seeing cybersecurity in there. And then then it gets even lower, it gets even worse when you look at training on information security, and with with all the vendors and business, so when you're talking about people connecting with your networks, how little information they really know, and really making them aware of the risks. And then of course you jump back up, you get more than 70% of IAs had experienced cyber-related incidents. Now, which I said earlier as well, a majority were malware-related and fraudulent emails, that phishing exercise. I can't begin to tell you just how common that is. And the number and I have a collection of these fantastic emails that people fall for. And some of them are fantastic in terms of how they look, but other ones, I still can't understand the ones. The other day we had someone who asked about, who was talking about they needed information. They actually asked for a significant amount of money because they were talking about their jet lease. Now, it turns out that the company didn't even own a jet or have a lease to a jet, but somehow they're willing to pay $750,000 via wire to for the next payment on their jet. So it's interesting how well you can fool some people. So part of this, as I said, there's this examination initiative that's really to look at cybersecurity incident or risks. And part of it is, again, to establish, the policies and procedures and oversight, protect network information, and we're going to, and I'm going to go all this in a lot more detail in just a moment. But the whole idea is really to understand, going back to that earlier slide when I talked about understanding what you have in your environment, how you need to protect it, and what are you going to do to prevent and to mitigate the risks of that, and how you're going to prevent unauthorized activity. So one of the things that the SEC again has made clear is that this next initiative is really just an exam. It's sort of the next level from the prior exam, the roundtables and the guidance. It's sort of now they were trying to understand really what people were doing and where the risks were. And now they said, now that we understand a little bit that background, now we're going to start to target and see what are companies actually doing now that we know what the risks are. Do they actually take those efforts to have policies and procedures that are reasonably designed to protect against those threats to security or integrity of customer information? Is that really the case? And how do you test that? What do you do? And so we have this new initiative now, which is this focus on evaluating the firm's implementation of those systems. And these are the ones that OCIE believes the firm should have. So again, the whole point of this initiative is, are you prepared as an entity for, in terms of cybersecurity? And they've decided, it's going to be more than 50 registered broker-dealers and investment advisors. And here are the risks that they are going to focus on. Cybersecurity governance, and I have actually this in yet another view. I don't know if it's more entertaining to look at it this way. But the whole idea is to really look at these, break them into different categories, and understand the risks. And now we're going to go walk through each of these, so you don't need to stare at that slide for too long. So the first thing is looking at your governance and risk assessment, and really what are you going to be held accountable for? So it's do you have appropriate, and have you identified appropriate cybersecurity governance and risk assessment? So looking at what you have in your environment, do you have a process in place to identify and understand what things you need to consider, what risks that you have in your environment? How are you reviewing that? Do you have some type of annual or routine basis to evaluate cybersecurity risks? Is that and part of it is there's the plan aspect of it, which generally speaking is considered sort of on an annual basis. But you have but some cybersecurity risks, they evolve thousands of days. What are you doing in your environment? How are you addressing and looking out for new things and incorporating them into your program? Because that doesn't necessarily mean you have to change the entire program. You just may need to update software, malware, or look at things differently. But when you look at what you have in your environment, there's lots of, let's call it off-the-shelf programs and policies that one could buy, but do you have something in place to evaluate that is tailored to your environment, not just buying something off the shelf? Because it turns out there's a lot of basic controls that you should implement, and there's other controls that if you that by only having sort of basic or off the shelf, you're missing lots of things for your particular environment. What happens? How do you internally escalate it? But one of the other interesting things that they did note again is communication and involvement of senior directors and management and board of directors, and we see this industry-wide, across different industries as well. Is that really taking this up to the most senior management, the C-suite of a company, the board of directors, and making them liable in the event of an incident, such that they need to be aware and stay aware. And so this needs to be a top priority for companies across the board and have that regular communication. Again, access rights and controls, I touched on that briefly before, but again, making sure that you have those controls in place to prevent unauthorized access to files, to data, to systems, et cetera, your own employees, third parties, vendors, contractors, outside entities. So your system should start to understand, is this the appropriate person? Is this the appropriate credential that should be accessing? If not, why? And by the way, I should flag this so somebody knows there may be something going on. So, and how well do you utilize those access controls? So it turns out there's lots of companies who have actually put in systems that have the ability to actually control access, but they don't actually use them, or at least use them appropriately. They may set them up on day one and never change it. So as employees leave the company, they never turn them off, or as they get promoted or moved from one division to another, they don't change the restrictions, so they don't realize that somebody has access to information they shouldn't have. And often that's usually the way it is, that people continue to gain access. They don't always lose access. And it was really funny. We did an analysis on one company not that long ago. We found out that they had over 100, I think it was about 100, over a little north of 100 of employees who were deceased. I mean, and I know that sounds crass to say it that way, but these are people who that access should have been closed out long ago. And then there's another, I think 60 or 70 of employees who went to competitors, and they still had access. So it's just amazing how often that gets missed. And then also, as I said in the bottom one, is just, do you review it? That's part of the whole point. Is does somebody review it? Is there a system in place to ensure that all of these things are correct, that are up to date, that are current, that are not causing you liability? With respect to data loss prevention, what do you do to prevent, data from flowing out of an organization? There's lots of ways to do it. One of the big ways is that, there's lots of patches that come out on a regular basis. Is somebody actually implementing these? Because these patches are designed for security flaws, that once a security flaw is found, that patches get issued, and the public becomes aware of patches. So there's lots of attacks that are launched purely because a patch is announced, a vulnerability is announced, and they look for companies that have poor patch management, that don't implement these processes, and they attack them. And it's an amazing just how frequently that is. I mean, if you look at when you look at the content, or when you look at what are the common vulnerability index, when you look at just what are the major sources of breach, the top 10 are stuff that things have been out for years. At least at the most recent was 3 years in terms of patches available. So meaning that you can probably shore up 98% of all of this issue here if you just had proper patch management. And it's amazing just how, and some of these things date back for more than a decade. So something to be aware of. But that's something that they're looking at to make sure how do you monitor that within the environment, and do you have a process in place to ensure that gets taken care of? But also one of the other things is that lots of companies' data flows out inappropriately. So do you have something in place to understand where your data is, what the data is, and where it should be flowing to? And it's amazing how many times data gets out, forgetting just, and everyone focuses on, well, you have someone who logs in via Gmail or Hotmail or something else, or downloads to a flash drive, and absolutely that happens, absolutely that's a risk. but there's lots of really insidious attacks that go in and take data. They go inside, they launch attack inside and send the data out via another method, or move it from one system to another to get it to a place where it can get out without being detected, but that data is still flowing around within the organization. So that's just, and then also just how, when you do tag data, how are you able to identify where it is within it? Vendor management, and I've harped on this quite a bit, so you're probably already sick of me talking about it, but really one of the big focuses on looking at vendor management. How do you do diligence on vendors? What is your process? Do you have an appropriate way of doing so? What is the risk profile? How do you determine whether a vendor is a high risk or low risk? What do you have in those agreements for contractual obligations? What have you looked at their information security practices? Who has access? Where is the information? There's risk. There's both risk onshore and offshore. But do you know where the information is? Do you restrict who has access, where the information is? But as I said, one of the main risks that companies face, and the one that's least addressed, really is the vendor environment. And just because it's just something that people don't do, and there's a lot of times saying, I can't tell you the number of negotiations where someone says, well, the vendor's not going to sign the agreement, or this is just getting ridiculous. I don't want to have this negotiation. So you give up the information security, and it's amazing just what that risk brings onto the environment. And then training. Training is one of the most important things because it's again, training, as I said, one of the most most risk. High risk elements within an environment is really the employees, the contractors, the vendors, all the human element to it. And training, unfortunately, I've seen a terrible job throughout a lot of different industries. Just are people getting trained well enough, and do you make that available? And train when you onboard people, when you offboard, do you have regular monthly, annual trainings, whatever it may be, and the constant barrage of emails that constantly go out with saying, hey, are you aware of, have you seen? Or and I work with companies, and I have clients who do this as well, who have these programs that actually go out and train, provide the training videos and the content and samples. And I've done this myself just based upon the stuff that I've collected in all these investigations. But also it's there's this other great program I was working with a client on, we were developing, which is this idea, it's a layer over it. And it's amazing just how awful the response is to it. I mean awful in terms of just, not in a good manner. But the idea that people click on things or read things, that the software is able to detect maliciousware, malware, and things like that, and pops up a screen saying, are you sure you want to do that? And it's amazing that once people start to see things, real time and understand the risks that they're doing, and they get little warnings and things like that, the behavior then starts to taper off. But I have seen, but training, in the employee access, is just absolutely a critical element. Now, one of the things I'll just sort of pause here, I noted that the training really should be this unintentional actions of employees, including, misplaced laptops and downloading attachments and clicking on messages. But I'll just give you an example. For not that long ago, FINRA had fined a broker-dealer $225,000 for violating Reg SP when one of the employees, and there's a lot of questions behind this, but left an opened laptop in a public restroom, and contained information, account numbers, and names, addresses, and tax IDs for about 352,000 clients. Again, Rule 30 of Reg SP provides that every broker-dealer must adopt a written policy and procedure to address the administrative, technical, and physical safeguards for the protection of customer records and information. And that same idea of appropriate administrative, technical, and physical safeguards is like the basic language you'll find in any agreement across any industry, and that's sort of the very baseline. And there's some other issues in that particular situation as well, that this particular company, this laptop failed to use, certain, measures to protect the information, and this was an incident that occurred back in May of 2014, but it was back in May of 2015 that the fine was instituted. But the whole idea is it's not uncommon. I can't tell you the number of times I have responded to incidents where employees are just negligent, and not to say that they do it on purpose, but the times that they leave these things unavailable. I had one where a company was transferring information from one facility to the other via a USB key, and their whole security was the person wore it around their neck. It was unencrypted. I can't begin to tell you just how many problems it was there. But we have the wonderful video of the person not noticing it while at lunch at a McDonald's. The USB key drops onto the tray goes into the trash gets emptied into the dumpster, and we have beautiful video of the employee then going in, dumping doing a dumpster dive. And that's just not fun for a lot of different reasons. The drive was never recovered, but you can't really tell, did somebody else get it? Who knows? But this idea of just not, of training, of just having procedures in place, making employees aware of the risk that they bring to an organization, and having those procedures in place, and also training. On the flip side is that you need a plan to respond to an incident, and so you need to have that written policy and procedure in place, which we'll talk about in a moment. But you have to train the employees and the personnel to actually respond to them and do their job. Which, and I've done lots of these incident trainings, simulated incidents, and it's amazing just how it seems great on paper, and how many companies, until you do it a couple of times, till they really start to get the act together, and everyone starts running around, like a chicken without a head for a while, because, it's either that they're very complacent because they know it's a training exercise, or when they don't know it, the first time it happens, everyone forgets that there's a plan in place, and they just run wild. So it's really something that's got to be trained, and it's got to be on a regular basis. And then finally, the whole idea of incident response is, again, everyone's looking for, whether it's going to be, CFTC, SEC, or anyone else, is your written policies and procedures for having this plan in place that covers everything that we just talked about. And, what happens when there's an incident response? What happens when, what are your procedures? How do you protect information? How do you identify, when there is an incident, do you identify and classify data, things that, were affected by an incident? How do you respond to them? Who's going to respond to them? What's the chain of command? Who's the spokesperson for the company? When do you notify your outside providers, your lawyers, your PR people, the FBI if appropriate, or other, law enforcement agencies? How do you respond to your customers? Who's responding? And so if there's an incident with a vendor, is the vendor responding? Is it you responding? What are the processes in place? And that's fairly significant. And then this is not necessarily on their list, but I say you're going to see this, these last two issues come up, and you're going to see them as part of this whole overarching thing. And I wouldn't be surprised in the next sort of risk alert, you'll see something like this being in there. Is sharing, and you also heard it. It's becoming public. It's becoming popular. This idea of sharing intelligence, cyber intelligence, and information sharing. Understanding those risks that are within an organization. How do you propagate it so that when one organization learns about it, without compromising, the inability to talk to competitors and all sorts of other institutions and all the other stuff. But how do you share that information in a manner that's appropriate with others, so that not every, so that once something is found out, it doesn't become an industry-wide epidemic or pandemic. And then also cybersecurity risk, insurance. Should, everyone on this phone probably, the fact that you're listening and dialing into this, this should be something you're already on top of. But, again, nothing's ever 100%. Even insurance isn't 100%. But there really should be, looking at what type of cybersecurity risk you have. And again, and to this day and age, I still can't get over the number of companies that think they have cybersecurity insurance. Turns out they don't, and it's, they don't find out till it's too late. In fact, I had one customer, one client, I should say, late last year, who thought they had a policy in place, and it turns out that, again, despite better judgment, they misread it, whatever it may be. And instead of thinking they had, they actually only had $25,000 to cover a cyber incident, as opposed to their $25 million policy that's taken out, whatever that may be. So, okay. So some other key initiatives and, takeaways from all of this before we flip over to look at a case and then talk about the NFA, which is, again, OCIE, is expecting now under this new initiative, under the second initiative, is really, you have to have more than some generic cookie cutter cybersecurity policy. I have been in lots of meetings. I've been in lots of discussions. I've been with the FTC makes the same comments in their, in their investigations that I've been involved in, and across the board is one thing. Having nothing is really bad, but having something you buy off the internet, and probably the best one that I ever had was someone did buy a policy off the internet and download it, and it said, and it's still in their bound copy of the plan on their shelf, said, open bracket, insert company name here, close bracket, throughout the entire book. Clearly they bought it. Clearly it was generic. Clearly it was not organized for their industry. In fact, it had lots of paragraphs that say, industry, would say, if this is appropriate for this industry, utilities, financial, healthcare, whatever it may be, choose what's appropriate. Absolutely, when this happened, the comment was, holy cow, we could not have asked for a better, for a better thing to look at in terms of just someone who's just flagrantly saying we don't give whatever about, these we're just gonna stamp, the rubber stamp here and move on. That did not go well. It just said there was nothing they got. There was no leniency given to the company. But bottom line is, you need a plan. You need one in place. You need to have. It needs to be, and as I said it several times already, it needs to be appropriate, tailored to your organization, tailored to the information that you have, tailored to the risks that you have based upon a review, and at the very least, that policy, the big policy itself, should be reviewed on an annual basis. It should have information, should talk about having communications with the board, being involved, as well as having, obviously a lot, that plan should have things about how to continually evolve and be aware of external threats. Sorry, apologies for the coughing. But again, and even if you have the policy and it's implemented, it's got to be monitored because, you have to have a policy and it's got to be used. It's not, again, this is not a shelf plan. Maybe it's not the appropriate way of saying it, but having one on the shelf that that's full of dust, not appropriate at all. And again, and an effective policy, one of the things they've stated over and over again is it's got to have an incident response plan. It's not good enough just to say that we're going to monitor everything else, but when something happens, you have to be able to take action, and you have to be trained to take action and be able to. And that is, as I noted here on the bottom, that firms that fail to implement those basic controls are at an increased risk, and apparently also an increased risk for a typo, but it should be a risk alert regarding all, there really should be ways to, again, it should be that basic controls, again, are not enough, and it's really got to be tailored, and I'm stressing that over and over because it's stressed by, the OCIE quite a bit. So we're going to take a quick sort of commercial break here for the RT Jones case to understand sort of, which is just rather entertaining that this came out a week after the, the risk alert came out. But essentially, the whole idea was that, here was the first case. Well, it's actually not really the first case, depending on how you look at it, but the first case certainly since the risk alert came out. And while this case was settled, as I note on the bottom, it does underscore the fact that a company really does need to have a robust written procedure, that written plan in order to detect and respond, et cetera, to cyber incidents. But the whole idea is this was a case where, again, third party, came in, or something, there was a violation, there was a hack that exposed customers' information to, for identity theft. Now, the case essentially was their third-party web server, again, third-party common theme, was attacked by an unauthorized intruder, never discovered who it was. We know it came from China. We know they got access to nearly 4 years of person-identifiable information. Interesting enough, the information was not encrypted. Therefore, the company did not take adequate means to protect and ensure the safety and security of that information. In fact, the firm said, though, their process of doing so was they just restricted access to, to administrators. But obviously, that didn't really prevent anyone from getting access to the information or keeping it safe. So going throughout, lots of people, lots of information. Now, what probably saved them is that the firm really did jump into place and get a lot of things moving on. They hired investigators. They hired multiple cybersecurity firms to investigate the risk, consultants and everyone else. They reviewed log files. But because they just didn't have the right processes and procedures in place, they didn't have log files. They didn't have all those other things that your written policies and procedures will have in terms of keeping log files, and making sure you have the right backup. So even when an intruder tries to destroy them, you should have a backup somewhere. They should be reviewed. All that information, there was no way to determine what happened. So sometimes you say you have to fear the worst. The company did provide, information to those individuals who have been compromised. But, turns out that so far there's no known case that somebody's actually been harmed by that. But, the interesting enough, in some industries they talk about, there's this whole idea of damages, that a company is responsible. There's damages, there's liability, where there's damages to a consumer, but here the OCIE is saying we don't really care about looking at it from that perspective. We want to know, do you have the processes and procedures in place? So even if there's no incident, right, if nothing has happened to your environment, you have for some act of, who knows what, there's never been an incident in your environment, you're still liable. You're still responsible. You still could be on the hook if you don't have a plan in place. So even when all is good, if you don't have that plan in place, if you don't have all those other things we talked about, you're going, you could go down in flames, even if customers are all safe. So eventually the charges, again, were violation of Rule 30. SP talked about that. We've now, and this is similar to the quote that I mentioned. Well, this is the actual rule when I quoted before about ensuring the security and confidentiality of customers' records and information, protecting against anticipated threats or hazards to security, and protecting against unauthorized access. I mean, all of this is really what happened. Why under the safeguards rule, where RT Jones found themselves responsible. And again, the SEC again, it was settled, so who knows? But alleged they just did not have those written policies and procedures. So even though there was apparently potentially no harm, they just didn't have, they didn't have them. And so that's again a lesson that I keep having to pound over again. And so essentially, sanctions, censure, cease and desist from violations. I don't exactly know what that means. Cease and desist from future violations of Rule 30 or Regulation SB, because it just means you got to comply. But the other thing that I found very interesting in my review of all this that I don't really see it happen often is that they actually didn't impose a requirement for an independent compliance consultant to review and to make sure that they're compliant. I mean, that's something I would have thought, and I'm sure lots of people did. Maybe it's because they did so much to respond. Who knows? But something I don't expect to happen very often. So now flipping over a little bit more with a few minutes left to spare on the National Futures Association. That again, so one of the members sort of announced they were a victim of a cybersecurity incident involving unauthorized access to consumer information. In this particular case, they had detected a small number of unauthorized wire transfers and accounts, and they had process in place to do so, which was great. They actually got all the funds back. But it was interesting that they received an email from a hacker claiming to have unlawful access to their customer information, which I found fascinating. Who would do that if I were a hacker unless there's something else going on, and maybe maybe it's a decoy, who knows? But they immediately notified the FBI. Seems all is good, potentially, who knows? But it is. But so what did the NSA do? They issued the Information Systems Security Program or the Cybersecurity Initiative Notice, and saying that all all CFTC registered, all members. It's going to apply across the board, and if you fall into one of these many categories here, that's you. And as I said, I anticipate soon that this is going to be, all financial services across the board are going to see some type of compliance as well. And the CFTC, is also considering some additional requirements we'll talk about in a moment. But the whole idea is that these are they want written information security system programs, procedures to secure customer data and access to electronic systems across all members, and also, again, appropriate to the circumstances. So doing that in internal investigation, understanding what your systems are, what's appropriate, what's tailored to your environment. And this will become effective on March 1st, 2016. So this notice, now what's interesting, is consistent with a whole bunch of other cybersecurity, guidance published by other financial regulators, including 2015 guidance update by the SEC's Division of Investment Management. But there's a couple of caveats, though. So this actually, while it's consistent, it's more detailed. One of the big thing is, like in all of these programs so far, we may see this change, and I think you're going to see as part of this, the OCIE, examination initiative is to understand, and it may be that one day they're looking at, here's what we're going to tell you what to do, but for now, that form, in this case as well, of that written information security program, that's up to each member. So right now they're going to allow a lot of sort of somewhat leeway on that, but this notice here for the NFA is more detailed and provides some additional requirements. So a lot of, depending on where you fall into this category, some people may have to look at, and some organizations may have to look under both sets of guidance to determine what's going to be applicable to them, and to review this notice to determine do their cybersecurity programs protect, and do they comply with the guidelines, and what additional sort of actions do they need to actually implement in order to meet the ISSP requirements by the effective date. So, and looking at that, so what is in an ISSP? Well, it's again, just like before, it's a security and risk analysis, understanding what's your environment, what do you need for your environment, how do you protect the information, What should you be doing? Do you know what are the threats? How do you determine? How do you identify a threat or a vulnerability in your system? What do you do to fix that? How do you evaluate, when there isn't an event? What measures do you take to respond to it? What type of education do you provide? Education? How do you educate? What's the content of that education? And there's sort of the review and education. There's sort of the review and training. So that, again, just like before, I talked about that, some executive level official needs to review, this is now your board, your C-suite, all those people who normally, maybe they don't always, but in a lot of cases, this was really an IT issue for many years, or privacy. This never really got up that high in an organization, but now there's a lot of regulated sort of liability and risk and requirement of obligations for executives to take ownership of these things and to really review these processes and make sure they're compliant. And they need to provide, and all the NFA members have to provide employees cybersecurity training. So it's ensuring that they actually get trained on these things. And they must assess the risks imposed by third-party service providers. Again, and they talk about critical third-party service providers. We're talking about those types of things like, the infrastructure companies. And here's where it gets a little bit more, strenuous, to say the least, because you also talk about, carrying out controls and testing and penetration testing and incident planning responses. So it's not just doing your diligence. You need, it's actually analyzing these things and going and checking them out and looking at, those, especially those critical companies. Now that cybersecurity is one of the core principles that the agency is going to be using in conducting its examinations. So in terms of compliance with the Commodities Exchange Act, so it's something that is at the forefront of all this. So, again, if you take a look at these sort of slides, I can sort of compare them to the ones earlier on in terms of what are the guidelines. So here are the guidelines as well. And again, apologies for the small font on the right. But again, your written program, your a security analysis, what do you do, protective measures against the identified threats, respond, and recover from incidents that threaten the security of the systems, employee training. And you'll see that these really do follow, in sense, the similar view of this slide to the earlier slide of the NIST guidelines and the OCIE guidelines. So we're seeing that a lot of it is really the same concept over and over again, but there also is the level of understanding. There's some additional things under the NFA that one really needs to look at. So again, as I mentioned already, NIST, in terms of that's one of the categories. One thing we're going to look, one thing to sort of take away, these are again the general categories underneath NIST. Again, exact same thing from the prior slide. How do you identify, respond to, recover, et cetera, from a cybersecurity incident? And then NFA had put out a list of here's what we view as some examples of safeguards to be implemented. So here's a whole list. You can take it back just to see this is not inclusive. Therefore, even if you complied with all of these things, it would not be enough, potentially, again, based upon analysis at your entity or at your firm. But the whole idea is, again, things like, physical protection, complex passwords, changing them, firewalls, everything up to date, monitoring, unauthorized access, preventing against unauthorized software, patch management, backing up systems, encryption, security, all sorts of things that that are necessary. So a few quick things before the end of this. One, sort of what does the future hold when we look at all of this thing? Cybersecurity regulators are watching. I've added a few more in here. We already know SEC, FINRA, FTC. I also added the FCC, and there's plenty of others out there who are all getting into the space that, depending on what you do, depending on who you are, there's lots of people out there looking, and you're going to see in some cases, we've had one client I'm aware of that had multiple regulators asking them questions, and the question is who sort of gets priority. And that's a good question. OCIE has already issued 2 rounds of guidance, conducting another round, 1 round of examinations. The second one is pending. You're going to see a lot more questions being asked. In terms of other things, we're going, I expect that when you see, after the second round of examinations, you're likely to see significant compliance, given, enforcement actions. I think you'll start to see those based upon what is going on based upon the findings. You're going to see, I expect, another risk alert. And so now I suggest, and we're going to go right into the polling question, and then I'll give, if I have a moment or two, I'll try and answer some questions and give you some other facts and figures that are of interest, but I want to make sure everyone gets the polling question. So the last thing I'm going to say is I can't imagine a better time than now that for every company to review the previous guidance, perform a gap analysis of what you have, and if you find a gap, you better fill it, because I have a feeling that we're not going to see under the first round was, oh, that's an interesting finding. I'm glad that you see that. Or, we didn't know that maybe that's a better risk, that's a bigger risk than we thought. Now it's sort of, well, here's what we've told you we're looking for. We've given you the entire list, and you still failed to comply with that. I think that's going to be a concern for companies. So I'm going to run right into the polling question, turn it over to Dave for a moment.
Thank you very much, Aaron. So yes, at this time, we're going to read the CLE code for this program. If you're in need of CLE credit today, you'll just need to enter this 5-digit code into the text box in the slide area and click Submit. So the code for today is UBA0N. That's U as in uniform, B as in Bravo, A as in Alpha, 0, N as in November. And so again, if you are seeking credit, please fill that into the text box in the slide area and hit Submit. And again, if you are seeking Kansas, New York, or New Jersey CLE credit, in addition to filling out this polling question, you will need to complete the attorney affirmation form found in the resource widget to your left and return it immediately following the program. Once again, one last time, the code is U as in uniform, B as in Bravo, A as in Alpha, the number 0, and N as in November. Leave this up for another 15 seconds here.
All right, so while that is up, I will just make a quick sort of commercial announcement as well and just say that for those of you submitting it, please put it through the box on the screen. And I appreciate all those people asking me questions about the security, or not the security, the CLE code, but I don't know what to tell you about that. So put them into the form, not asking me the questions directly. So hopefully that will help everyone get their credit. But so I'll leave you with a couple things. I see there are some questions. Given the time of the program, I will follow up with everybody after who asked questions to make sure we get those answered, or you can feel free, reach out to me, email me, call me, carrier, message page, I don't know, message in a bottle, but I'm happy to talk with everybody about their questions. But some alarming things just to think about currently in terms of looking at numbers and why this is such the big risk that it is. In terms of the amount of time it takes to compromise a system, about almost 40% of all attacks happen within seconds. Over 60% take just a few minutes. The amount of time it takes to extract the information out of an environment, it takes about over a quarter. Within minutes, all the information is extracted from an environment, then it's gone. Now, interestingly enough, more than a quarter of all incidents take days to months to years to actually time to detect the breach. In fact, there's a number of breaches that take 2 to 3 years to detect, or in terms of when the initial attack happened. Currently, there are more than 7 million known vulnerabilities. The top 10 accounted for 97%. And actually, earlier I think I said 98%. But the reality is, again, if you just accounted for the top 10, which, by the way, again, I can't stress enough, none of them are new. The newest one is a threat of almost over 2 years ago now, that if you had patched for those 10 most common vulnerabilities, you're talking 97% of your risk gone. In terms of age, almost all known vulnerabilities have been available. Patches have been available for months or years, talking again about patch management. Can't stress that enough, again, how difficult it is. And about 23% of recipients open phishing emails, and 11% of recipients open up the attachments in phishing emails. And with that, it is now the top of the next hour, so I will say thank you to all. We will follow up with your questions. If you do have any questions for me, though, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer them.